Sarah Martinez stepped through the glass doors of Elite Combat Academy, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. The facility was everything she had imagined and more. High ceilings stretched above sparring mats, heavy bags hung in perfect rows, and the sound of gloves hitting pads echoed throughout the space. The smell of sweat and determination filled the air. At 22, Sarah looked nothing like what people expected from someone entering a combat training facility. Standing at 5 feet 4 inches with a slight build, she appeared more suited for a college library than a fighting gym. Her long black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore basic workout clothes that looked fresh from the store. Everything about her screamed beginner. The academy was known for producing some of the finest fighters in the region. Professional mixed martial artists, security personnel, and law enforcement officers all trained here under the guidance of world-class instructors. It wasn't a place for the faint-hearted or those looking for a casual fitness class. As Sarah approached the front desk, she noticed several experienced fighters watching her with curious eyes. Some whispered among themselves, clearly wondering what brought this ordinary-looking young woman to such an intense training facility. The receptionist, a muscular man with cauliflower ears and numerous scars, looked up from his paperwork. "First time here?" he asked, his tone neutral but his eyes assessing. "Yes, I'm here for the beginner's program," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. The man handed her a clipboard with forms to fill out. As she worked through the paperwork, more people gathered in the lobby area. Word seemed to spread quickly about the new recruit who looked completely out of place. Among the onlookers was Jake Thompson, a 28-year-old fighter who had been training at the academy for 3 years. He considered himself one of the more experienced students and often took it upon himself to evaluate newcomers. Jake had short blonde hair, a muscular build, and the confident swagger that came with knowing how to handle himself in a fight. "Another wannabe," Jake muttered to his training partner, loud enough for Sarah to hear. "Probably watched too many movies and thinks she can become a fighter overnight." His comment drew chuckles from several nearby trainees. Sarah pretended not to notice, but her grip tightened slightly on the pen she was using. She had heard similar comments before, and they always stung more than she cared to admit. Lisa Chen, another regular at the gym, shook her head as she watched Sarah. Lisa had been training for 2 years and prided herself on being one of the few women who could hold her own with the men. She felt protective of the gym's reputation and worried that inexperienced people might lower the overall standard of training. "She'll probably quit after the first week," Lisa said to her friend. "Most people don't realize how brutal real combat training can be." The academy's philosophy was simple but demanding. Train like your life depends on it. There were no participation trophies or gentle encouragement for those who couldn't keep up. Students were expected to push themselves to their absolute limits, and those who couldn't handle the intensity were quietly encouraged to find other pursuits. Sarah finished her paperwork and handed it back to the receptionist. He reviewed it quickly, noting that she had marked no previous martial arts experience in several boxes. This only confirmed what everyone had already assumed about her. "Training starts in 15 minutes, he told her. "Locker room is down that hall. You'll need to change into appropriate gear." As Sarah walked toward the locker room, she could feel eyes following her every step. The whispers continued, and she caught fragments of conversations that weren't particularly encouraging. "She's going to get hurt," someone said. "Why do they even let people like that in here?" another voice added. "It's not fair to the serious students," came a third opinion. Sarah entered the locker room and sat down on one of the benches. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight of everyone's expectations. They all saw her as a mistake, someone who had wandered into the wrong place and would soon realize her error. But Sarah had her own reasons for being there, reasons that nobody else knew about. She had spent months researching different training facilities, reading reviews and watching videos of various fighting techniques. This academy had the best reputation for producing skilled fighters, and that was exactly what she needed. As she changed into her training clothes, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her here. Growing up in a small town, she had always been underestimated. Teachers, classmates, and even family members had consistently viewed her as fragile and incapable of handling challenging situations. She had grown tired of being seen as someone who needed protection, rather than someone who could protect others. The locker room door opened, and Lisa walked in with 2 other women. They glanced at Sarah briefly but didn't acknowledge her presence. Their conversation continued as if she weren't there. "I heard Coach Rodriguez is leading the session today," one of them said. "He's not going to go easy on anyone, especially newbies." "Good," Lisa replied. "Maybe it will help separate the serious students from the tourists." Sarah finished changing and made her way back to the main training area. The space had filled with more people, all of whom looked like they belonged there. Men and women of various ages moved with the fluid confidence that came from years of training. They stretched, shadowboxed, and practiced techniques with an ease that made everything look effortless. Coach Miguel Rodriguez entered the training area, and conversations immediately died down. He was a legend in the combat sports world, a former professional fighter who had transitioned into teaching after retiring from competition. At 45, he still moved with the grace and power of someone half his age. His presence commanded immediate respect from everyone in the room. Coach Rodriguez's eyes swept across the assembled students, taking note of familiar faces and identifying the newcomers. When his gaze landed on Sarah, he paused for just a moment longer than with the others. His expression remained neutral, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he was making mental notes. "Welcome to Elite Combat Academy," he announced, his voice carrying easily across the large space. "For those who are new, understand that what we do here is not a game. We train warriors, not weekend hobbyists. If you're looking for a casual workout, there are plenty of other gyms in town that will be happy to take your money and tell you what you want to hear." His words seemed directed at everyone, but several people glanced at Sarah as he spoke. She stood quietly among the group, trying to blend in while simultaneously preparing herself for whatever was about to come. "Today we're going to start with basic conditioning," Coach Rodriguez continued. "Then we'll move into fundamental striking techniques. After that, we'll do some light sparring to assess skill levels." The mention of sparring caused a ripple of excitement among the experienced students and visible concern among the newer ones. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but not from fear. For the first time since entering the academy, she felt a spark of anticipation. The conditioning session began immediately, and it was unlike anything most newcomers had ever experienced. Coach Rodriguez led the group through a series of exercises that pushed every muscle to its limit. Burpees, mountain climbers, bear crawls, and sprints were combined in a relentless sequence that had even experienced fighters breathing heavily. Sarah kept pace with the group, moving through each exercise with surprising efficiency, while other newcomers struggled and fell behind. She maintained her form and rhythm. Her breathing remained controlled, and sweat beaded on her forehead without the gasping and stumbling that characterized the other beginners. Jake noticed her performance during the conditioning phase but dismissed it as beginner's luck. "She'll crash when we get to the real training," he whispered to his friend. Cardio is one thing, but fighting is completely different. The group moved from conditioning to technical instruction. Coach Rodriguez demonstrated basic striking techniques, explaining the mechanics of proper punches, kicks, and defensive movements. His demonstrations were precise and powerful, each movement flowing seamlessly into the next. "Technique trumps strength every time," he explained while showing a basic jab. "A perfectly executed strike with proper form will always be more effective than a wild swing from someone who doesn't understand the fundamentals." Students paired up to practice the techniques they had just learned. Sarah found herself partnered with Maria Santos, a woman in her early 30s who had been training for about 6 months. Maria was friendly enough but clearly skeptical about Sarah's ability to contribute meaningfully to their practice session. "Don't worry about hitting too hard," Maria said as they began working on basic combinations. "It takes time to develop proper technique." Sarah nodded and threw her first few punches at the pads Maria was holding. Her form was textbook perfect. The punches snapped out with precision, and the sound they made against the pads was crisp and clean. Maria's eyebrows raised slightly, but she didn't comment. As they continued practicing, Sarah's technique remained flawless. Her footwork was balanced, her strikes were accurate, and her defensive positioning showed an understanding of combat principles that typically took months to develop. Other pairs nearby began to notice, and subtle glances were exchanged. "Have you trained somewhere else before?" Maria asked during a brief break. "No, this is my first time in any kind of fighting gym," Sarah replied honestly. Maria looked confused but accepted the answer. Perhaps Sarah was just naturally athletic and a quick learner. Some people had natural coordination that helped them pick up physical skills faster than others. Coach Rodriguez moved through the pairs, offering corrections and advice. When he reached Sarah and Maria, he observed their practice for several minutes without saying anything. Sarah's technique was so clean that he found himself looking for flaws that simply weren't there. "Good form," he said finally, though his tone suggested he was more puzzled than impressed. "Keep working on consistency." The technical portion of the session concluded and Coach Rodriguez announced that they would move into light sparring. This was always the most revealing part of any training session. Technique could be learned and conditioning could be developed, but sparring revealed how someone actually handled the stress and unpredictability of combat. "We'll start with controlled contact," the coach explained. "Focus on technique and timing rather than power. The goal is to learn, not to prove how tough you are." Experienced fighters paired up first, and the sound of gloves meeting gloves filled the air. Their movements were fluid and calculated, each exchange a chess match of positioning and timing. The newer students watched nervously, knowing their turn would come soon. Jake stepped forward when Coach Rodriguez called for the next group. He had been waiting for this moment, eager to show everyone why he was considered one of the more skilled students in the academy. His confidence was evident as he pulled on his gloves and moved to an open mat. "I'll take the new girl," Jake announced, pointing at Sarah. "Someone needs to show her what real sparring looks like." Several people exchanged glances at Jake's obvious attempt to make Sarah look foolish. It was a common initiation ritual at many gyms. Experienced fighters would overwhelm newcomers to establish the pecking order and discourage those who weren't. Serious about training, Sarah didn't protest the pairing. She simply nodded and began putting on the protective gear that Coach Rodriguez handed her. Her movements were calm and methodical, showing no signs of nervousness or intimidation. "You sure about this, Jake?" Lisa called out from across the room. "She's never done this before." "Exactly," Jake replied with a grin. "Better she learns now what she's gotten herself into." Coach Rodriguez frowned at Jake's attitude but allowed the pairing to proceed. Sometimes harsh lessons were necessary to separate those who belonged from those who didn't. He would intervene if things got out of hand, but a little humility might be good for both fighters. The other students gathered around the mat to watch. Word had spread quickly that the new girl was about to get her first taste of real combat training. Most expected it to be over quickly, with Sarah either getting overwhelmed or backing down entirely. Sarah and Jake touched gloves in the center of the mat. Jake's grip was firm and slightly longer than necessary, a psychological tactic meant to intimidate his opponent. Sarah's return grip was brief but solid, her eyes meeting his with steady confidence. "Just try not to get hurt," Jake said with false concern. "This isn't like the movies." Sarah didn't respond verbally, but something in her expression shifted. The nervousness that had been present earlier was completely gone, replaced by a focused intensity that seemed out of place on someone so inexperienced. Coach Rodriguez signaled the start of the sparring session. Jake immediately pressed forward, throwing a series of basic combinations designed to overwhelm a beginner. His punches were controlled but assertive, meant to establish dominance early in the exchange. Sarah's response surprised everyone watching. Instead of backing away or getting flustered, she moved with the fluid grace of someone who had been fighting for years. Her head movement was subtle but effective, allowing Jake's punches to slide harmlessly past their targets. Her footwork kept her in perfect position to counter, and her defensive positioning was textbook perfect. Jake increased his aggression, throwing harder and faster combinations. He was beginning to feel frustrated that his initial assault hadn't produced the expected results. Sarah continued to move smoothly around the mat, her defense making Jake look clumsy and predictable. "What the hell?" Jake muttered under his breath as another combination missed its mark. The watching students had gone quiet, their expectations completely subverted by what they were seeing. This wasn't how sparring sessions with complete beginners were supposed to go. Sarah wasn't just surviving Jake's attacks. She was making him look ordinary. Coach Rodriguez watched with growing interest. Sarah's movement patterns were too sophisticated for someone with no training experience. Her timing was too precise, her positioning too intelligent. Something didn't add up about her background. Jake's frustration reached a boiling point. He abandoned his controlled approach and threw a powerful right cross, putting significant force behind the punch. It was exactly the kind of escalation that Coach Rodriguez had been watching for. Sarah saw the punch coming from the moment Jake shifted his weight. Time seemed to slow as she calculated her response. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the opportunity to show everyone exactly who they were dealing with. Her counter was swift and devastating. She slipped Jake's wild punch with minimal movement, simultaneously stepping forward and throwing a perfectly timed uppercut that caught him completely off guard. The punch landed clean on his chin, and Jake's eyes rolled back as his knees buckled. The gym fell completely silent as Jake collapsed to the mat, unconscious before he hit the ground. The silence in the gym was deafening. Everyone stared at Jake's motionless form on the mat, then at Sarah, who stood calmly over him with her gloves still raised in proper defensive position. The knockout had happened so quickly that most people hadn't fully processed what they had witnessed. Coach Rodriguez was the first to move, rushing to Jake's side to check his condition. Years of experience had taught him how to assess unconscious fighters, and he quickly determined that Jake was breathing normally and would recover without serious injury. Still, the power behind Sarah's punch had been significant enough to put down a trained fighter. "Someone get ice," the coach called out, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "And call the medic." As other students scrambled to follow his instructions, Coach Rodriguez turned his attention to Sarah. She had lowered her hands and stepped back from Jake, but her posture remained composed and alert. There was no celebration in her expression, no shock at what she had accomplished. If anything, she looked like someone who had simply completed an expected task. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" Coach Rodriguez asked, his voice low enough that only Sarah could hear. "I told you. This is my first time in a combat gym," Sarah replied, her tone steady and honest. The coach studied her face carefully, looking for signs of deception. He had interviewed countless fighters over the years and prided himself on being able to detect lies and half-truths. Sarah's expression showed no indication that she was hiding anything, but her performance made her claim impossible to believe. Jake began to stir, his eyelids fluttering as consciousness slowly returned. Several students helped him sit up, and he looked around with the confused expression of someone trying to piece together what had happened. When his gaze fell on Sarah, his confusion deepened. "What happened?" Jake asked, his words slightly slurred from the impact. "You got knocked out," Lisa said bluntly, "by the new girl." Jake's face went through several emotions in quick succession: disbelief, embarrassment, and finally anger. He had been training for 3 years and considered himself one of the better fighters in the gym. Being defeated by someone who claimed to have no experience was a blow to his ego that he couldn't easily accept. "That was a lucky shot," Jake said, struggling to his feet. "It won't happen again." Coach Rodriguez placed a firm hand on Jake's shoulder, preventing him from moving towards Sarah. "You're done for today. Go sit down and let the medic check you out." The authority in the coach's voice left no room for argument. Jake reluctantly allowed himself to be led to a bench along the wall, where he sat with an ice pack pressed against his jaw. His eyes remained fixed on Sarah with a mixture of resentment and confused respect. The other students began to gather around Sarah, their initial dismissive attitudes replaced by cautious curiosity. The woman they had written off as a tourist had just knocked out one of their most experienced members with a single punch. It was the kind of performance that demanded explanation and respect. "That was incredible," Maria said, approaching Sarah with wide eyes. "I've never seen anyone move like that, especially not a beginner." "The way you slipped his punch was perfect," added another student. "And your counter timing was flawless." Sarah accepted the compliments politely but didn't elaborate on her performance. She seemed more interested in continuing the training session than discussing what had just happened. Her casual attitude toward such an impressive display only added to the mystery surrounding her background. Coach Rodriguez called for everyone's attention. "Training continues," he announced. "What happened here is exactly why we emphasize control and respect in sparring. Everyone needs to remember that we're here to learn, not to prove anything." Despite his words about continuing the session, the atmosphere in the gym had completely changed. Students moved through their remaining exercises with frequent glances at Sarah, trying to reconcile her appearance with her demonstrated abilities. Conversations buzzed with speculation about her true background and experience level. Lisa approached Coach Rodriguez during a break in the training. She had been watching Sarah carefully since the knockout, looking for clues about her fighting background. "There's no way she's never trained before," Lisa said quietly. "That kind of technique takes years to develop." "That's what I thought too," the coach replied. "But her paperwork shows no previous experience. and she seems genuinely unfamiliar with gym protocols and terminology. They watched as Sarah worked with a heavy bag, her punches landing with consistent power and precision. Each strike demonstrated textbook form, and her movement around the bag showed an understanding of angles and timing that typically required extensive training to develop. Maybe she trained somewhere unofficial, Lisa suggested. Like with a private instructor or in a different style that didn't involve formal gym membership. Coach Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. It was possible that Sarah had received high-quality instruction outside of traditional martial arts schools. Some of the most skilled fighters he had encountered over the years had learned from unconventional sources. Military training, street fighting experience, or family members who had passed down fighting knowledge. The remainder of the training session proceeded without incident. But Sarah remained the center of attention. Everything she did was scrutinized for clues about her background. Her conditioning was excellent, her technique was precise, and her understanding of fighting principles was clearly advanced. When Coach Rodriguez demonstrated a complex combination involving footwork, head movement, and counterpunching, Sarah executed it perfectly on her first attempt. Other students who had been training for months struggled with the coordination required, but Sarah made it look effortless. "She's making us all look bad," one student muttered to his partner. "It's not fair," another replied. "How are we supposed to improve when someone with no experience is already better than people who have been here for years?" The resentment was beginning to build among some of the regular students. They had worked hard to develop their skills and establish their place in the gym's hierarchy. Sarah's arrival and immediate dominance threatened the order they had become comfortable with. As the session wound down, Coach Rodriguez made an announcement that surprised everyone. "I want to see Sarah stay after class for some individual assessment," he said. "Everyone else can head to the showers." Students began filing out of the training area, but many lingered near the exits to see what would happen next. Jake, who had recovered enough to remove his ice pack, positioned himself where he could observe the private session. Sarah remained on the main mat as the gym emptied. She showed no signs of fatigue despite the intense training session, and her focus remained sharp and alert. Coach Rodriguez gathered some additional equipment and approached her with a serious expression. "I'm going to be direct with you," he said. "What I saw today doesn't match your claimed experience level. Either you're lying about your background or there's something very unusual about your situation." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I understand why you're confused," she said. "But I've been completely honest about never training in a formal gym before today." "Then explain to me how someone with no training can knock out a 3-year student with one punch," the coach demanded. "And don't tell me it was luck, because everything else you did today showed advanced skill and understanding." For the first time since entering the gym, Sarah's composed demeanor showed a crack of uncertainty. She looked around the nearly empty training area, then back at Coach Rodriguez. It was clear that she was debating how much to reveal about herself. "The truth is complicated," Sarah said finally, "and you probably won't believe it even if I tell you." Coach Rodriguez crossed his arms and waited. He had heard countless stories from fighters over the years, ranging from the mundane to the extraordinary. Whatever Sarah's explanation turned out to be, he was prepared to listen with an open mind. "I've been waiting my whole life for the chance to train properly," Sarah began, "but my situation made it impossible until now." Sarah took a deep breath before continuing her explanation. The weight of years of secrecy was evident in her expression as she prepared to reveal the truth about her background. "My father was David Martinez," she said. Watching Coach Rodriguez's face carefully for recognition, the coach's eyes widened immediately. David Martinez had been a legend in the underground fighting circuit 15 years ago, known for his devastating knockout power and unorthodox fighting style. He had disappeared from the scene suddenly, and rumors about what happened to him had circulated for years among those who remembered the underground days. "David Lightning Martinez?" Coach Rodriguez asked, his voice filled with disbelief.
"He was your father?"
Sarah nodded. "He retired from fighting when I was 7 years old. He said he wanted to give me a normal childhood, away from the violence and danger that surrounded his career. But he also knew that the world could be a dangerous place, especially for someone like me." The pieces began falling into place in Coach Rodriguez's mind. David Martinez had been famous not just for his fighting ability, but for his role as a trainer and teacher. If anyone could have produced a fighter of Sarah's caliber through private instruction, It would have been him. He taught you, the coach said, more as a statement than a question. Every day from the time I could walk, Sarah confirmed, but he made me promise never to use what he taught me unless it was absolutely necessary. He said fighting should be a last resort, not a way to solve problems or prove yourself to others. Sarah's explanation continued as she described her unusual childhood. While other children played normal games, she had spent hours learning footwork, defensive positioning, and striking techniques. Her father had been a demanding but patient teacher, emphasizing control and responsibility above all else. He taught me that real strength comes from knowing you don't have to prove it to anyone, Sarah said. That's why I never joined school sports teams or got into fights with other kids. Dad said the right time would come eventually. Coach Rodriguez found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about David Martinez. The underground fighting world had portrayed him as a violent man who lived for combat. But Sarah's description painted a picture of someone who understood the responsibility that came with dangerous skills. Why now? The coach asked. What changed that made you decide to train publicly? Sarah's expression grew somber. Dad passed away 6 months ago, cancer. Before he died, he told me it was time to find my own path and use what he had taught me. He said I needed to decide for myself how to apply the skills he had given me. The revelation explained so much about Sarah's performance that day. Her technique wasn't just advanced. It was refined through years of one-on-one instruction with a master. Her calm demeanor under pressure reflected the discipline that had been instilled in her from childhood. Her respect for the power of violence came from understanding its true consequences. I chose this academy because of your reputation for producing fighters who use their skills responsibly. Sarah continued. Dad always spoke highly of trainers who taught their students to be protectors rather than aggressors. Coach Rodriguez was quiet for several minutes, processing what he had learned. The mysterious new student who had shocked everyone was actually the daughter of a legend, trained from childhood in techniques that most fighters never mastered. Her beginner status was technically accurate. She had never trained in a formal gym, but her skill level was far beyond anything that designation implied. The other students don't know who your father was, the coach observed. And I'd prefer to keep it that way, Sarah said quickly. I want to earn my place here based on my own efforts, not because of my father's reputation. I don't want special treatment or to be seen as some kind of novelty. The coach understood her desire for anonymity, but he also recognized the challenges it would create. Sarah's skill level would continue to surprise and frustrate other students who didn't understand her background. Managing those dynamics would require careful handling. What happened with Jake today, Coach Rodriguez said, was that you defending yourself or making a point? Defending myself, Sarah replied without hesitation. He escalated the intensity beyond what was appropriate for controlled sparring. When someone throws a full-power punch at my head, my training takes over automatically. The honesty of her response impressed the coach. Sarah wasn't trying to minimize what had happened or claim it was an accident. She had recognized a threat and responded accordingly, just as her father had trained her to do. We need to establish some ground rules, Coach Rodriguez said. Your skill level means you could seriously injure people here without meaning to. We have to find ways for you to train effectively without overwhelming the other students. Sarah nodded eagerly. This was exactly the kind of guidance she had been hoping to receive from a professional instructor. Her father had taught her techniques and principles, but he couldn't provide the structured training environment she needed to continue developing. I want to learn everything I can, she said, but I also want to help other people improve. Dad always said that teaching was the best way to master something completely. The coach smiled at this comment. David Martinez's philosophy was clearly evident in his daughter's attitude toward training and competition. The focus on growth and helping others was rare in combat sports, where ego and aggression often dominated. There's something else you should know, Coach Rodriguez said. Jake isn't going to let what happened today go easily. His pride was hurt badly, and he's the type who holds grudges. Sarah's expression didn't change, but the coach noticed a subtle shift in her posture. The relaxed stance she had maintained throughout their conversation became more alert and ready. I don't want trouble with anyone, Sarah said, but I won't apologize for defending myself either. Good, the coach replied. But be careful. Gym politics can be complicated, and you've already upset the established order just by being here. They spent the next hour working through various techniques and scenarios. Coach Rodriguez wanted to assess Sarah's full range of abilities and identify areas where formal training could enhance her natural skills. What he discovered was both impressive and concerning. Sarah's striking was flawless, her defensive instincts were excellent, and her understanding of timing and distance was exceptional. However, her grappling skills were limited, and her knowledge of formal rules and competition strategies was minimal. She was a perfect street fighter who needed to learn the nuances of organized combat sports. "Your father taught you to survive and protect yourself," the coach observed. "Now you need to learn how to compete and teach others." As their private session concluded, several students who had been waiting outside began filing back into the gym for the next class. Jake was among them, and his eyes immediately locked onto Sarah with undisguised hostility. "Word about today is already spreading," Coach Rodriguez warned quietly. "People are going to want to test themselves against you. Some will be respectful about it, others won't." Sarah gathered her gear as more students entered the training area. She could feel the weight of their stares and hear fragments of whispered conversations about the afternoon's events. The anonymity she had hoped to maintain was clearly impossible now. "What do you recommend?" she asked the coach. "Train hard, stay humble, and remember that respect has to be earned every day," he replied. "Your father's reputation might have opened doors, but your own actions will determine how this story ends." As Sarah headed toward the locker room, she passed Jake and several of his training partners. Their conversation stopped abruptly when she approached, and the tension in the air was palpable. "This isn't over," Jake said quietly as she passed. Sarah paused and looked back at him. "It doesn't have to continue either," she replied calmly. The exchange was brief, but everyone within earshot understood that the conflict between them was far from resolved. Sarah's diplomatic response only seemed to increase Jake's frustration, and his friends appeared ready to support whatever action he might take. Coach Rodriguez watched the interaction with growing concern. He had seen similar situations before, where talented newcomers became targets for established students who felt threatened. The difference was that Sarah possessed skills that could seriously hurt someone if the situation escalated beyond verbal confrontation. The foundation for future conflict had been laid, and everyone involved seemed to understand that the day's events were just the beginning of a larger story. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's dramatic introduction to Elite Combat Academy, and the dynamics of the gym had shifted considerably. Word of her knockout victory over Jake had spread throughout the local fighting community, drawing curious visitors and creating an atmosphere of tension that affected everyone who trained there. Sarah arrived for her usual morning session to find the gym busier than normal. Several unfamiliar faces were scattered throughout the training area, and she could feel their eyes tracking her movement as she made her way to the locker room. The attention made her uncomfortable, but she had learned to ignore the stares and whispers that seemed to follow her everywhere. Coach Rodriguez approached her as she finished warming up. His expression was serious, and she could tell he had something important to discuss. "We have a situation developing," he said quietly. "Jake has been talking to people outside the gym, and some of his friends from other academies are asking questions about you." Sarah felt a knot forming in her stomach. This was exactly what she had hoped to avoid when she decided to keep her father's identity secret. The last thing she wanted was to become the center of drama that could affect other students at the academy. "What kind of questions?" she asked. "They want to know if the story about you being a complete beginner is true," the coach explained. "Some of them think you're a professional fighter using a fake identity to make the gym look bad." The accusation was both frustrating and ironic. Sarah had been completely honest about her background, but the truth was so unusual that people preferred to believe she was lying. Her father's intensive private training had created abilities that seemed impossible for someone without formal gym experience. "What do you want me to do?" Sarah asked. Before Coach Rodriguez could answer, Jake entered the gym with 3 other men. Sarah recognized one of them as Marcus Stone, a professional fighter from a rival academy, who had a reputation for aggressive behavior both in and out of the ring. The group moved through the training area with the confidence of people who expected others to get out of their way. "There she is," Jake said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "the mysterious beginner who hits like a truck." Marcus studied Sarah with the calculating gaze of someone sizing up an opponent. He was significantly larger than Jake, with the scarred hands and hardened features of someone who had been fighting professionally for years. His presence in the gym immediately raised the tension level for everyone present. "She doesn't look like much," Marcus said dismissively. "Are you sure she's the one who put you down?" Jake's face reddened at the reminder of his defeat. "It was a lucky shot," he insisted. "Anyone can get caught if they're not expecting real power from a beginner." The conversation was clearly intended to provoke Sarah into responding, but she continued with her training routine as if she hadn't heard them. Her father had taught her that words were just another form of pressure testing, and the best response was usually no response at all. Coach Rodriguez intervened before the situation could escalate further. "This is a training facility, not a playground," he announced. "Anyone who isn't here to train seriously can find the exit." Marcus smiled at the challenge in the coach's voice. "Actually, I am here to train," he said, pulling out a day pass. "I heard you have some interesting sparring partners here, and I wanted to see for myself." The implication was clear to everyone in the gym. Marcus had come specifically to test Sarah, probably at Jake's invitation. Coach Rodriguez found himself in a difficult position. He couldn't refuse to let a paying customer train, but he also knew that Marcus's intentions went far beyond normal sparring practice. Sarah continued her heavy bag work, her combinations flowing with the same precision she had displayed since her first day. Each punch landed with a satisfying thud that demonstrated both power and control. She was aware of the developing situation but refused to let it affect her training routine. Other students in the gym began gathering around the edges of the training area. Word spread quickly that something significant was about to happen, and nobody wanted to miss the confrontation that seemed inevitable. The atmosphere became electric with anticipation and nervous energy. "I'd like to work with the new girl," Marcus announced, his voice carrying across the gym. "Jake tells me she's got some natural talent that needs to be properly tested." Sarah finally looked up from her training. She could see the challenge in Marcus's eyes and the expectant faces of everyone watching. This was the moment she had been dreading since her first day at the academy. Her desire to train quietly and avoid attention had failed completely. Coach Rodriguez stepped between Sarah and Marcus. "We don't do challenge matches here," he said firmly. "This is a learning environment, not a proving ground." "I'm not challenging anyone," Marcus replied with false innocence. "I'm just looking for a good sparring partner. Surely that's what gyms are for." The distinction was meaningless and everyone knew it. Marcus was a professional fighter who outweighed Sarah by at least 40 pounds. Any sparring session between them would effectively be a fight, regardless of what they called it. Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of declining or making excuses, she stepped forward and addressed Marcus directly. "I'll spar with you," she said calmly, "but we follow Coach Rodriguez's rules exactly. Controlled contact, protective gear, and he stops it if anyone gets reckless." The gym fell silent. Even Coach Rodriguez looked shocked that Sarah had accepted what amounted to a challenge from a professional fighter. Marcus grinned with satisfaction, clearly believing he was about to expose Sarah as a fraud in front of everyone. "You sure about this?" the coach asked Sarah quietly. "You don't have anything to prove to these people." "Yes, I do," Sarah replied. "If I back down now, this will never stop. Every tough guy who wants to test himself will show up here looking for me. Better to settle it once and for all." Coach Rodriguez reluctantly agreed to referee the sparring session. He insisted on full protective gear for both fighters and established strict rules about contact levels and prohibited techniques. Despite his precautions, everyone understood that the session carried real risks for both participants. As Sarah and Marcus prepared for their confrontation, the gym filled with more spectators. Students from other classes arrived early, and several people who weren't regular members appeared as if summoned by some invisible network of communication. The sparring session had transformed into an unofficial event that would be talked about for months regardless of the outcome. Sarah's preparation ritual was the same as always. Quiet, methodical, and focused entirely on the task ahead. She stretched thoroughly, shadowboxed to warm up her combinations, and spent several minutes in meditation-like concentration. Her father had taught her that mental preparation was just as important as physical readiness. Marcus's preparation was more theatrical. He spoke loudly to his friends, made jokes about the mismatch, and threw powerful combinations at the heavy bags to demonstrate his strength. His behavior was clearly intended to intimidate Sarah and entertain the crowd that had gathered to watch. "Last chance to back out, little girl," Marcus said as they approached the center mat. I won't go easy on you just because you're new to this. Sarah's response was to touch gloves respectfully and take her fighting stance. The contrast between her quiet confidence and Marcus's loud bravado was evident to everyone watching. Two completely different approaches to combat were about to be tested against each other. Coach Rodriguez called the fighters to the center and reviewed the rules one final time. Controlled contact means controlled contact, he emphasized, looking directly at Marcus. Anyone who forgets that will be stopped immediately and asked to leave. The crowd pressed closer to the mat as the fighters took their positions. Jake watched from the front row with eager anticipation, convinced that Marcus would quickly expose Sarah's limitations. Lisa stood nearby with a worried expression, concerned about what might happen to someone she had grown to respect over the past few weeks. Are you ready? Coach Rodriguez asked both fighters. Sarah nodded once, her expression calm and focused. Marcus bounced on his toes and rolled his shoulders, displaying the nervous energy of someone preparing for violence. Begin, the coach announced. Marcus immediately pressed forward with an aggressive combination designed to overwhelm Sarah before she could establish her rhythm. His punches were fast and powerful, thrown with the confidence of someone who had knocked out numerous opponents in professional competition. Sarah's response was poetry in motion. She slipped the first punch with minimal head movement, stepped off the center line to avoid the second, and ducked under the third while simultaneously throwing a counter that caught Marcus on the ribs. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds and left Marcus off balance and confused. The crowd murmured in appreciation of Sarah's defensive skills, but Marcus quickly regrouped and continued his assault. He threw a series of kicks mixed with punches, using his reach and weight advantages to try to corner Sarah against the edge of the mat. Sarah's footwork kept her out of danger, while creating opportunities for her own attacks. She landed a clean left hook to Marcus's body, followed immediately by a right cross that snapped his head back. Both punches were thrown with controlled power, but their precision and timing made them highly effective. Marcus's expression changed from confidence to concern, as he realized that Sarah was not only surviving his attacks but countering effectively. His breathing became heavier, and his movements lost some of their initial crispness. The pace he had set was unsustainable against an opponent who made him miss consistently. 3 minutes into the sparring session, Marcus made a critical error. Frustrated by his inability to land clean shots, he abandoned the controlled contact rules and threw a full-power right hand aimed directly at Sarah's head. Sarah saw the punch coming from the moment Marcus shifted his weight. Time seemed to slow as she calculated her response to what was clearly an attempt to hurt her seriously. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. When someone tries to harm you, you have the right to protect yourself by any means necessary. Her counter was swift and devastating. She slipped Marcus's wild punch, stepped inside his guard, and delivered a picture-perfect uppercut that caught him flush on the chin. The punch was thrown with all the power and precision that 15 years of training had developed. Marcus's eyes rolled back as his legs gave out completely. He crashed to the mat with a sound that made everyone in the gym wince sympathetically. The knockout was even more spectacular than her victory over Jake, and the silence that followed was profound and lasting. Sarah stood over Marcus's unconscious form with the same calm composure she had shown after knocking out Jake. There was no celebration, no showboating, just the quiet satisfaction of someone who had successfully defended herself against an aggressor. Coach Rodriguez knelt beside Marcus to check his condition, while the crowd processed what they had witnessed. The professional fighter who had come to expose a fraud had been knocked unconscious by a single punch from the woman he had intended to humiliate. "Is he okay?" Sarah asked, genuine concern evident in her voice. "He'll be fine," the coach replied. "But his ego is going to hurt for a long time." As Marcus slowly regained consciousness, the reality of his situation became clear. He had been knocked out in front of a room full of witnesses by someone he had dismissed as a pretender. The embarrassment would follow him throughout the fighting community and damage his reputation significantly. Jake's reaction was a mixture of vindication and horror. He felt vindicated because Marcus's defeat proved that losing to Sarah wasn't a sign of his own weakness. But he was also horrified because Sarah had just demonstrated that her victory over him wasn't luck or accident. It was the inevitable result of superior skill meeting inferior preparation. The crowd began to disperse, but the conversations continued in hushed tones throughout the gym. Sarah had now knocked out 2 experienced fighters in spectacular fashion, and her reputation was growing beyond anything she had wanted or expected. Coach Rodriguez approached her as she began removing her protective gear. "We need to talk," he said seriously. "This situation is getting out of control, and we need to figure out how to manage it before someone gets seriously hurt." But for the first time since her first day at the academy, she felt like she had a plan for moving forward. Instead of being a victim of circumstances beyond her control, she was going to take charge of her own destiny and face whatever challenges came next on her own terms. The meeting with David Chen would determine the next chapter of her story, and Sarah was finally ready to write it herself. The meeting with David Chen took place in an upscale restaurant downtown, away from the chaos that had surrounded Elite Combat Academy. Sarah arrived with Coach Rodriguez, both of them curious about what the prominent fight promoter would offer. Chen was a well-dressed man in his 50s who had built a reputation for discovering talented fighters and creating compelling storylines that attracted large audiences. He greeted Sarah with obvious excitement, clearly seeing her as a potential goldmine for his promotion company. "I've been promoting fights for 20 years, Chen began, "and I've never seen anything like what you've accomplished. 3 knockouts in 3 weeks, all against experienced fighters, all captured on video. You're already more famous than fighters who have been competing professionally for years." Sarah listened politely as Chen outlined his vision for her professional debut. He wanted to create an event around her story, marketing her as the mysterious woman who had appeared from nowhere to dominate everyone who challenged her. The promotion would emphasize her underdog background and the dramatic nature of her knockouts. "The opponent I have in mind is Jessica Torres," Chen continued. "She's a former regional champion with 15 professional wins and a reputation for durability. If you can defeat her convincingly, it will establish your credibility with the serious fighting community." Coach Rodriguez asked detailed questions about the contract terms, medical requirements, and safety protocols. He was impressed by Chen's professionalism and the level of support he was offering to provide for Sarah's training and preparation. "What about my privacy?" Sarah asked. "I don't want my personal life turned into entertainment for other people." Chen nodded understandingly. "We can control the narrative to some extent," he said. "You don't have to reveal anything about your background that you're not comfortable sharing. The mystery surrounding your skills could actually be part of your appeal." After 2 hours of discussion, Sarah agreed to Chen's proposal. The fight would take place in 6 weeks, giving her time to prepare specifically for professional competition. The purse was substantial enough to provide financial security, and the platform would allow her to address the speculation about her background on her own terms that the announcement of Sarah's professional debut created. A media frenzy that dwarfed the attention she had received previously. Sports networks picked up the story, and ticket sales for the event broke records for a debut fighter. The narrative of the unknown woman challenging an established champion captured public imagination in a way that surprised even Chen. Sarah's training intensified dramatically as she prepared for her first professional fight. Coach Rodriguez brought in specialized sparring partners and technical experts to help her develop strategies specific to fighting Jessica Torres. The preparation was more systematic and scientific than anything she had experienced, even during her years of training with her father. "Your father taught you to survive and protect yourself," Coach Rodriguez explained during one training session. "Now you need to learn how to perform under pressure and adapt to an opponent who has studied your techniques." The weeks leading up to the fight were filled with media obligations that Sarah found exhausting and intrusive. Interviews, photo shoots, and promotional appearances consumed hours that she would have preferred to spend training. The attention was overwhelming for someone who had valued privacy and anonymity. 3 days before the fight, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at the gym. An elderly man approached her during a break in training, introducing himself as Roberto Santos, one of her father's former training partners from the underground fighting days. "David spoke about you often," Santos said. "He was proud of your skills but worried about how you would handle the pressure of public attention. I think he would be impressed by how you've managed this situation." Santos shared stories about her father that Sarah had never heard, painting a picture of a man who had struggled with the violent aspects of his career but found peace in teaching his daughter to use her abilities responsibly. "Your father's greatest victory wasn't any fight he won," Santos continued. It was raising a daughter who understands that true strength comes from protecting others, not dominating them. Don't let the fame and money change that. The conversation with Santos reminded Sarah of why she had started training in the first place. Her goal had never been to become famous or wealthy. She had simply wanted to honor her father's legacy and use her skills to help others. The professional fighting opportunity was a means to an end, not the end itself. The night before the fight, Sarah sat alone in her hotel room, reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 weeks earlier, she had been an unknown woman hoping to train quietly at a local gym. Now she was about to compete in front of thousands of people and a television audience of millions. Her phone buzzed with text messages from friends, family members, and fellow students at Elite Combat Academy. The support was overwhelming and helped calm her nerves about the upcoming competition. She realized that regardless of the outcome, she had already accomplished something significant by inspiring others to pursue their own goals. The day of the fight arrived with unprecedented media coverage and public interest. The venue was sold out, and the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Sarah's arrival at the arena was met with cheers from fans who had been following her story since the first viral video. In the dressing room, Coach Rodriguez helped Sarah prepare mentally for the challenge ahead. "Remember everything your father taught you," he said. "Trust your instincts, stay calm under pressure, and fight your own fight rather than trying to match what your opponent wants to do." Jessica Torres was everything that advertised, a skilled, experienced fighter who had never been knocked out in her professional career. Her record included victories over several top-ranked opponents, and she had the confidence that came from years of success in the ring. The introductions were elaborate affairs that emphasized the contrast between the two fighters. Torres was presented as the established champion defending her territory against an unknown challenger. Sarah was introduced as the mystery woman who had captivated the fighting world with her spectacular knockouts. As they stood in the center of the ring for the referee's instructions, Torres looked directly into Sarah's eyes with the intensity of someone who had spent weeks studying video of her opponent's techniques. "I've figured out your patterns," Torres said quietly. "You won't catch me the way you caught those amateurs." Sarah didn't respond verbally, but her expression showed no concern about Torres's confidence. She had spent 6 weeks preparing for exactly this type of opponent, someone who would take her seriously and come prepared with specific strategies. The bell rang and Sarah's professional fighting career officially began. Torres immediately implemented a cautious game plan designed to neutralize Sarah's knockout power. She kept her distance, used constant movement to avoid being cornered, and threw quick combinations before backing away. Her strategy was clearly to avoid the kind of exchanges that had led to Sarah's previous knockouts. For the first 2 rounds, Torres's approach was successful. She landed more total strikes and avoided the big counterpunches that had made Sarah famous. The crowd grew restless as the fight failed to produce the dramatic moments they had expected, based on Sarah's previous performances. Sarah adapted to Torres's tactics in the 3rd round, using her superior footwork to cut off the ring and force closer exchanges. She began landing cleaner strikes as Torres's constant movement began to affect her stamina and timing. The turning point came in the 4th round when Torres attempted a combination that left her slightly off balance. Sarah recognized the opening immediately and responded with the same type of precise counterpunch that had knocked out her previous opponents. The punch landed flush on Torres's chin, but the experienced fighter absorbed the impact and continued fighting. For the first time in her brief fighting career, Sarah had landed a clean knockout punch that didn't end the fight immediately. Torres's ability to survive Sarah's best shot seemed to energize her, and she pressed forward with renewed aggression. The final 2 rounds were intense exchanges that showcased both fighters' skills and determination. When the final bell rang, both women were exhausted but still standing. The fight had gone the distance, and the outcome would be decided by the judges' scorecards. The decision was announced as a unanimous victory for Sarah, but the margin was closer than many had expected. She had won her professional debut, but not in the spectacular fashion that had made her famous. In the post-fight interview, Sarah was asked about her future plans and whether she would continue competing professionally. "This fight taught me that there's always more to learn," she said. "I want to continue improving and facing new challenges, but I also want to help other people develop their own skills and confidence." The answer perfectly captured Sarah's evolution from an unknown gym Newcomer to a professional fighter who understood that true success was measured by more than victories and knockouts. She had found her path forward, one that honored her father's legacy while creating her own unique story. 6 months later, Sarah opened her own training facility with Coach Rodriguez as her partner. The gym specialized in teaching self-defense and confidence building to people who had been dismissed or underestimated by others. Her story had come full circle, from someone seeking training to someone providing it to others who needed the same opportunity she had once sought. The rookies who had once dismissed her as useless now sought her guidance, having learned that appearances could be deceiving and that everyone deserved the chance to prove their worth. Sarah's greatest victory wasn't any fight she had won. It was the community of strong, confident people she had helped create.